These Hindus were the ones who came up with this single point of concentration. They were the ones who came up with this amazing technique that enables a person to go to completely subdue the grosser sensory conceptual level and to access the subtler levels of consciousness that don't depend upon the brain and the body and the senses and the sense objects. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Yeah. So what Buddha is saying, and this is from these Hindus, that when we can access subtler levels of our consciousness, utilizing these marvelous concentration meditation techniques, when you're at a level of your consciousness that doesn't depend upon the grosser, your mind is naturally blissful. Just naturally. It's just the way it is. Mind that's not encumbered by delusions is naturally blissful. It doesn't need to be triggered by an object. You could say that. Do you understand?
Okay.
That's the point the Buddha's making. The true nature of our mind is bliss. This is not kidding. The only reason our minds are so tortured is because we've got a bag of bones we've got to lug around, this big painful bag of bones, and because of all the delusions that pollute our mind and make us live in nightmares every day. The delusions are in their nature fear and anxiety and panic and worry and depression. That's their nature. So we're always anxious, always worried, never pleasant. So when your mind is at a more subtle level, just naturally it's blissful. Naturally, it's just nature. We think pleasure is this dualistic thing that you've got to get by getting an object. That's the usual one we think, you know. That's the gross way we are in samsara. So this is why I always quote Venerable Rene, our wonderful Swiss monk friend, serious meditator for 35, 40 years. When I interviewed him in Mandala 10, 20 years ago, he told me about his single-pointed concentration meditation retreat in Spain. And he said, you know, as we know, it's described in terms of 9 stages of development of the subtle mind. The subtle, the subtle level of our consciousness. So he said he maybe just touched upon the 5th of the 9 stages. And he said, and I forget the words exactly, there's no question that the joy or the bliss that he experienced at that level of his mind, the 5th of the 9, was infinitely superior to any joy or bliss he had ever experienced through the medium of his senses. This is pointing out Buddha's point about the true nature of our mind. So, that, you know, it's not the goal, but it's just it's a bonus, you know. Do you understand?
Okay. Yes.
Now, the point in Tantra is this, the Vajrayana teachings, because of the makeup of a human being, having the channels, the winds, the kundalini, the actual components of a human body, according to that Vajrayana model, which is the same model the Hindus use, roughly speaking, what came out of the Hindus, the way that this body is made up and how having attachment, it has been found, as we can see ourselves, that certain objects of our senses trigger very, very pleasant feelings in our body and mind. Do they not, people? We know that. So Tantra takes that experience of a human being, and then the greatest yogis who've given up, who've got renunciation, which means they've given up attachment, way beyond attachment. They've got bodhicitta, and they've got profound realization of emptiness. Those yogis who are, you know, they are able to access a very powerful object of attachment, but because they have no grasping, because they have this body, it will still naturally trigger a very powerful, pleasant feeling at this subtler level. So that bliss that can be triggered in their mind by contact with an object, it's like a useful tool. The object's a useful tool that when it's combined with concentration, this bliss is like an atomic bomb that gets the mind to a very subtle level, which is the level we have to get any serious realization, which is called the clear light mind. Do you understand?
I think so.
Okay.
Thank you, Robina.
When you've got single point of concentration, you don't need objects. But it's been found that the mind doesn't go subtle enough using the sutra techniques. These tantric techniques, based upon the makeup of a human, it has been found by the greatest these great yogis that by having contact with an object of pleasure, an object of the senses, it can trigger, which we know it does, very powerful, pleasant feelings. But because a yogi doesn't have attachment, they don't get caught up in those pleasant feelings. Do you understand my point?
Yes.
So attachment is not a pleasant feeling. Attachment is the craving like a vampire to get a pleasant feeling. And when it gets a pleasant feeling, you crave even more and you want even more. And that's what messes it up completely. So when you've gone beyond attachment, your tongue doesn't fall out. When you've gone beyond attachment, you still taste cake. But the pleasure you experience will be much more refined and more subtle and more sublime than the pleasure we have now, which is like the pleasure of pigs when they eat hot shit. This is my good example.
Okay.
The pigs in Tibet. I always remember when you used to shit on these planks. I always remember these wild pigs, you know, waiting for the hot shit to come.
Yeah.
So our pleasure is like the pleasure of wild pigs eating hot shit. It's a good analogy, don't you think? But the yogis, because they all say about the pleasure that comes from attachment objects right now, contaminated pleasure. It's like, look at the pleasure that a junkie gets. It's clearly contaminated. Well, it's all a question of degree. Whereas the yogis have gone beyond attachment. But that doesn't mean their tongue falls out. They don't stop having contact, having pleasant feelings when you get touched. But their bliss is so much more refined because there's no greed, because there's no grasping. So they can utilize powerful objects of the senses in order to trigger the deepest bliss combined with concentration, and that gets you to the very subtle level, and that gets you enlightened. So it's a technique, it's a tool. Do you understand?